Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on assessing IUU fishing in Southeast Asia. We're going to allow for a minute for our participants to fill the room and then get started very shortly. Well, welcome again to all who are joining us from all over the world here at the Stimson Center to join us for the launch of a research and a project that's been in the works for several years. And it's an honor and pleasure to be working with the Stimson Center's Environmental Security Program on this project. I'm Brian Eiler, Director of the Stimson Center Southeast Asia Program. And again, on behalf of the Southeast Asia Program and the Environmental Security Program, welcome to our webinar on assessing IUU fishing in Southeast Asia. I've got to extend a big thanks to the research team, to Madeline McMurray, who led the research and the writing on this very important project, to Carolyn Gruber, who supported it all the way through and is the new project manager for this project, to Regan Kwan, who managed the data processes for this. Regan is in Nepal currently, otherwise he'd be joining us now. And then a big thanks to our partners on the ground in Southeast Asia, too many of whom to name, the scores of interviewees that participated in our interviews and later the surveys that informed this research, which you're going to hear about very soon. A big thanks to all of them. Let's go to the next slide. So today we're going to talk about assessing IUU fishing risk. That is the risk to illegal, unregulated, and underreported or unreported fishing activities in the South China Sea and the Sulu-Sulawesi seascape. What we've done is created a regional and comparative set of research methods to produce a number of products that we're going to overview here very soon that look at these two seascapes. The South China Sea, involving a very large section that's bordered by countries like China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Thailand. We brought Thailand in, the Gulf of Thailand, Cambodia as well, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And then the Sulu-Sulawesi seascape, which forms kind of by a triangle of the southern parts of the Philippines, eastern Malaysia, and then much of Indonesia, to look at a variety of risks related to IUU fishing. Let's go to the next slide. And in the news, you'll likely hear much about maritime security risks in the South China Sea, about collisions between fishing vessels, about China's surveillance ships, as well as its research ships that accompany these large and encroaching fleets that really destroy the marine habitats and deplete fish stocks around the South China Sea. You learn in the news a lot about island building, for example, by the really excellent project AMTI at CSIS, and the security risks that come from island building activities in the South China Sea. Next slide. And then the Sulu-Sulawesi seascape, the same is happening. There is wildlife trafficking, there is a depletion of corals, and also what we don't often hear about is the very rich abundance of fish species and other marine aquatic life in and around the ocean, in the seas of the Sulu-Sulawesi seascape, particularly in Indonesia. So moving past the headlines, what our work did is to take a deep look at how marine fish stocks are being affected by illegal fishing, how their habitats are being affected or destroyed by some of these activities. We look at the demand for fishing in the countries. We look at a number of economic indicators, what is driving both the demand for fishing, whether it's illegal or legal, and how that demand is driving this illegal activity. We take a deep dive into the labor sectors and labor treatment. We look at some of the human rights issues related to fishing practices. And also in our work, we bring insight into how coastal fishers or nearshore fishers are being affected by illegal fishing that's far away from them and that which is very close to them. And at the heart of this research is a call for regional collaboration. Much of this research that we're going to talk about today and the suite of products that we're going to introduce is targeted to regional partners, such as the Regional Plan of Action for IUU Fishing in Jakarta, CEFDEC in Thailand, and ASEAN's Working Group on Fisheries. And there are a number of recommendations for researchers like you, for organizations, for governments, on how they can take up the mantle of combating IUU fishing in these two seascapes. And to learn more about the methods that brought this work together, before we jump into the work itself, I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague Carolyn Gruber to take a deeper dive into some high-level findings and the methods. Carolyn, over to you.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Gruber. I am the Deputy Director of the Environmental Security team here at the Stimson Center. Thanks so much for being with us. This is such a pleasure to be able to finally release all of these exciting findings, all of the resources and recommendations that our team has been working so hard together with all of our partners on the ground for so many years. So first, before I get into our methodologies, I'll give you a flavor of the key findings in both the South China Sea and the Sulu-Sulawesi seascape. So I'm hopeful that it's pretty clear that both of these seascapes matter for many different reasons. In the South China Sea, more than half of the world's fishing vessels operate on a day-to-day basis within that seascape. The South China Sea is a rich fishing ground. It has lots of different pelagic species, tuna, squid, and other commercially important species. And so something that we really wanted to focus on here was, what are the issues that are driving IUU fishing, and what are the risks for maritime security in this space? As we've discovered, and as Brian very accurately uh, clarified, thinking past the headlines, we were able to apply this methodology and really get some concrete, stakeholder-led, community-based information, some data to support some of this work and some of these common findings. So, for example, one of the most interesting components here, I think, is the um, comparison between securitization of fishing grounds, which means increasing spending to support militarized enforcement. And this isn't necessarily for fishing issues. This is militarized enforcement for boundary issues. As I hope we're all aware, the South China Sea is sort of dealing with a lot of contentious maritime boundary issues. And so this focus on securitization of fishing grounds as a proxy for, okay, this is our space, we must enforce it. We reduce the spending on sustainable fisheries management. And as I mentioned before, the South China Sea is a very rich fishing ground, and a lot of folks, fisher folk, depend on it for their livelihoods and for their communities. And so adding this layer of tension around political and economic sensitivities related to small scale fisheries, related to artisanal fisheries, is a really complicated picture. And so the work that we've done here is to really piece apart this picture and understand what are the drivers, what are the impacts, and how we can move forward, as Brian mentioned. One of the other environmental components here that we're thinking about is island building activities on offshore fishing grounds. So this leads to a destructive practices for fishing. It results in some marine pollution and reduces the economic viability of fishing as a livelihood for small scale fishers. So this layered approach of drivers for IUU fishing is really supporting a race to fish mentality with respect to resource extraction. So this means that folks are competing against each other, both in domestic nearshore waters, but also in the broader South China Sea, which ultimately ends up in a degraded marine environment. Next slide, please. Thanks, Madeline. So in the Sulu-Sulawesi seascape, we found some very similar outcomes, especially related to porous national boundaries. This means that vessels are sort of going in and out of maritime boundaries. There's limited monitoring, control, and surveillance, which sort of supports this challenge of foreign flag vessels engaging in IU fishing. In the Sulu-Sulawesi Seascape, as Brian mentioned, this is located smack in the middle of the Coral Triangle. More than 40 million people are dependent on the Sulu-Sulawesi Sea for their livelihoods and for their communities, both in terms of food security and economic security. It's a global center of marine biodiversity. It's something that, so it matters beyond economic security, it matters for environmental security as well, and for the long-term sustainability of some of these livelihoods. We found in the Sulu-Sulawesi Seascape, as in the South China Sea, there's a depletion of fish stocks and habitat degradation caused by destructive fishing practices, caused by land development, which are all reducing that viability of fishing as a livelihood, as a sustainable livelihood for small-scale fishers. I think it's really interesting that we found in the Sulu-Sulawesi Seascape that the nation states bordering the Sulu-Sulawesi Seascape take more of a collaborative approach than in the South China Sea. As one might expect, the South China Sea has a lot of concerns in terms of maritime security and maritime boundaries. So this collaborative approach through the trilateral agreement in the Coral Triangle really offers an opportunity for joint maritime security initiatives, whether it's technical or operational enforcement opportunities. And so something to be, we'll dive into this a little bit more, and we absolutely welcome your questions about the findings, and we can get into a little bit more detail. But something we are really interested in is applying some of the lessons learned in the Sulu-Sulawesi Seascape to the South China Sea. Next slide, please, Madeline. Okay, now we're getting into the methodology, which is where I enjoy the most. So applying the CORVI methodology. So CORVI is actually a climate resilience methodology that our team at the Stimson Center has applied in 16 different small island states and coastal cities and communities around the world. It's the Climate and Ocean Risk Vulnerability Initiative, and it takes a holistic, data-driven approach to understanding risk and vulnerability in coastal cities related to the impacts of climate change. And so what we did, in a typical CORVI assessment, there's 10 categories of risk and more than 100 indicators of that risk. We took a scaled down approach to that methodology to apply it to IUU fishing. We wanted to take this methodology that's been proven so well in the climate resilience space in terms of filling data gaps and making sure that we can overcome the persistent challenge of data scarcity, especially at the subnational level related to climate resilience. So we wanted to take this methodology, scale it back a little bit, and then apply it to a new setting, a new challenge, and a new data scarcity issue. And so in order to do this, we assessed the 3 different categories of risk for IUU fishing. And we focused in these 2 regions, South China Sea and the Sulu-Sulawesi Seascape. So we picked 5 indicators of economic security, 5 indicators for environmental security, and 5 indicators for governance. And so as we've painted a picture here of the layering of these challenges and what it means to connect across, taking a holistic and comprehensive view of these 3 different drivers of IUU fishing and connecting them across and showing that they are truly integrated and inherently connected. So the great thing about the CORVI methodology is that it is at its core focused on the stakeholder. So our survey content is derived first from 50 semi-structured interviews, and we typically pair with some wonderful partners on the ground to make sure we're accessing the right people. We're getting a good mix of perspectives in our work. And so we did 50 different surveys, semi-structured interviews, surveys as well. And we use a methodology called structured expert judgment, where we take a very broad view of what an expert is in this work, because this is perceptions of risk. So we are working with folks who are on the ground dealing with the impacts of IUU fishing in their daily lives. And so this could be a local community leader, this could be a church leader, this could be a business owner, this could be a fisherman. We take a very broad view so that we can really truly capture the perspective of the community. Next slide, please. So I'll hand it over to my colleague Brian to give us a flavor for some of the findings, resources, and recommendations. But I wanted to take a moment to say that we worked very closely with lots of partners on the ground, and so being able to reflect their views and really drive towards solutions to these challenges rather than just stating the problem. The focus is always to find a solution and to work with our partners to find out what will fit and what we can do next. So I'll pass it over to Brian.
Thanks, Carolyn. And again, as anyone comes up with questions in your mind about the survey methods or these products or the research, we're going to go take deeper dives into the research here very soon. Please post your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And just to come back to some of what Carolyn was detailing with whom is interviewed for and whom is engaged for these surveys. Again, we look at the communities, we talk to fishers, we talk to community leaders. We also talk to ministry level officials, to staffers at the regional partner organizations like CTI, CFF, the Coral Triangle Initiative, or RPOA, IUU, NGOs, WWF, local NGOs, local transparency organizations that work on fishing to produce these reports that you see here. So these are 3 of the 4 products or research products that we're going to talk about today. The first 2 are long-form research products. They're great for the researcher, whether it is a government policy level researcher, a student of this issue in academia, NGO staff, or those at the regional partner organizations. These 60 to 80 page reports take a deep dive into the results across those 3, categorical indicators: economic indicators, environmental indicators, and governance indicators for IUU fishing. We produce policy recommendations inside, but I think the real kind of benefit of this research and these reports, first the IUU fishing risk profile for South China Sea, and then that for the Sulu-Sulawesi seascape, is it's just rich with contextual data about what is happening and what is driving IUU fishing in those 2 seascapes through the lens of this CORVI method that has been adapted for this process. The third product, Policy Roadmap, addressing IUU fishing in Southeast Asia, is a set of policy recommendations that both was derived from the research that produced the 2 previous reports, but also an activity that our team did with government and non-government stakeholders last 2 Januaries ago in Manila, to work with those who attended a conference on IUU fishing to come up with challenges related to IUU fishing and then turn those challenges into solution statements, which then our team polished into policy recommendations. Those policy recommendations, again, cover the 3 categories that we mentioned previously. And then they were sent back to those who attended the conference for comment and for revision. So there's been several rounds of socialization and circulation of that information already to the region. And we hope that key stakeholders are putting it to good use. These 3 products are available online. I'll have the team place the link in the chat that you can go check out the project page, download all of the products or access their short forms digitally. The policy roadmap has the entire format also produced digitally. And there's a fourth product that we're going to introduce here very soon, and that's a digital dashboard that also takes you through the results of the survey, results of our research, and also you can take a tour of the region as you go through it. So I'm going to turn it over to Madeline McMurray to both do a deep dive into some of our findings and give you a tour of our digital dashboard. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. I hope everyone can see my screen okay. My name is Madeline McMurray. I am a research assistant in the Environmental Security Program, and I've had the pleasure of working with Brian, Carolyn, and Reagan Kwan on this project since I started at Stimson. So I'm going to be giving you a brief overview of the data dashboard that we produced through the data provided in our IUU fishing risk profiles for the South China Sea and the Sulu-Sulawesi seascape. This dashboard's goal is to provide an overview of our key findings. The dashboard pulls from the risk analysis dataset, illustrating the key categorical risk scores, which are currently displayed. You're seeing the governance scores for the South China Sea, risk indicator scores within each categorical score, which appear on the right, and is further enriched with pop-out boxes developed from in-country interviews with experts in the region and desk research conducted by the Stimson Center. A very cool feature about this dashboard is that you can toggle between different seascapes. We have the Sulu-Sulawesi seascape here. And then you can also toggle between different countries to compare them directly or to focus on one country. So for example, very quickly, I will show a comparison between the Philippines and Vietnam. It's loading. And this is really interesting because you can directly see on the right the different indicators and how, while the categorical scores are similar, 5.77 for the Philippines and 5.73 for Vietnam, there is variation in the indicator scores that are feeding into that categorical score. So if you want to take a deeper dive and maybe understand why there are these variations, you can then toggle this button right here, and it will expand, which I will do in just a moment for the Philippines, and you can see more details, including the pop-out boxes that I mentioned before. So now, to really illustrate the utility of the dashboard, I'm going to provide a case study on the categorical governance risk for the Philippines. The map on the left provides the overall categorical risk for governance within Filipino fishing grounds in the South China Sea, with a score of 5.77 reflecting medium-high risk of IUU fishing due to many challenges in implementing counter-IUU fishing and sustainable fisheries programming by the government, and maybe opportunities and best practices that are currently being implemented by the government as well. The governance category consists of 5 indicators that feed into the average score that you're seeing on the left. The percent of territorial waters documented as protected, fisheries enforcement capacity, the percent of licensed and registered small-scale vessels, contested maritime boundaries, and then counter-IUU fishing and sustainability initiatives. Like I said before, by clicking the icon on the bottom right, more details are provided about what the indicator is assessing. So for the percent of territorial waters documented as protected, it registers as a 4.65 risk score, which is medium risk. And it measures the amount of a country's territorial waters designated with some level of government protection, such as marine protected areas, fisheries management areas, or others. And like I mentioned before, if you hover over the country, you'll see this pop-out box, which illustrates some very high-level findings that you can kind of read more about in our risk profile scores. So the medium risk illustrated here is reflective of the Philippines' expansive network of over 1,500 marine protected areas that are co-managed by local communities and the federal government in coastal areas. While this tempers the overall score being reported, making it a little bit lower than some of the other scores that we have seen before, the score is increased and the risk is increased increased due to incursions into marine protected vessels by commercial vessels, both domestic and foreign, and difficulties monitoring small-scale fleet activity in the marine protected areas themselves. Approximately 34% of assessed MPAs have actually improved fish biomass in the Philippines, which reflects some of these enforcement constraints in the conservation areas in Filipino waters. The score overall, once again, is tempered by the large network of MPAs and the Marcos administration, the current administration of the Philippines, pledging to protect 15.91% of its seas to meet global 30 by 30 goals, and current assessments being put into place of the efficacy of the marine protected areas, like I mentioned before. So moving to fisheries enforcement capacity, the second indicator, we can take a deeper dive into some of these challenges with enforcement, both in conservation areas and in fisheries management areas. The fisheries enforcement capacity indicator measures at 5.60 or medium high risk, which it assesses the capability of government institutions to enforce anti-IUU fishing laws and regulations in their territorial waters against national and foreign vessels. So like I mentioned before, you can have this pop-out box that goes a little bit into detail about what's being assessed here and what really produced this score. Key informants in the Philippines reported that there's a lot of confusion about overlapping maritime zones, what's allowed in one zone versus the other in the South China Sea, and differing definitions and regulatory requirements for vessels and small-scale fisher registration between the federal and municipal level, which leads to unintentional and sometimes intentional IUU fishing in the Philippines exclusive economic zone. KA's also reported that commercial vessel intrusions around contested areas, like Carolyn mentioned in the introduction, such as the Scarborough Shoal, increased the personnel and fisheries enforcement personnel focusing on those contested areas and the contested boundaries. And there's less personnel then dedicated to the Philippines' massive exclusive economic zone. The Philippines is roughly 80% water, I believe. So when all of the personnel is focused on the Scarborough Shoal, for example, there's a lot of areas for foreign vessels to encroach and to fish illegally. But moreover, it also increases the amount of nearshore overproduction for fisheries. As Carolyn also mentioned before, if you're putting all your money towards fisheries enforcement and in securitization, there's less money available for ecosystem-based fisheries management and capacity building in nearshore waters. Which increases the overall perceived risk of fisheries enforcement. Tempering this risk are efforts, once again, by the Marcos administration to expand MPAs and local governance over nearshore waters. Moving to the percent of licensed and registered medium and small-scale vessels in the Philippines as a risk score. It comes in at medium risk as well at around 4.50 and measures the ability and will of a government to regulate their artisanal and small-scale fisheries. The Philippines has an incredibly large artisanal and small-scale fleet. There's 2 million registered vessels and 80% of them are artisanal. Recent analysis indicates that approximately 30% of the total artisanal fleet is unregistered. And importantly, 2 million of 80%, that is definitely an undercount. It's very hard to register vessels and to monitor and account for all small-scale fishers. And 30% of the fleet being unregistered is largely due to cumbersome licensing processes, hampering license acquisition and vessel registration. Tempering the risk of this indicator and the previously mentioned fisheries enforcement indicator are recent initiatives by the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources to assist with boat registration and reporting in provincial zones to kind of streamline the process between federal regulation of coastal areas and municipal regulation of coastal areas. Now, moving to the highest risk indicator for governance in the Philippines, which I think might be no surprise to most people on this call. It is contested maritime boundaries, which comes in at high risk at 8.25. And it assesses the stability of the maritime security environment, the level of tension with other regional states, and extent of a state's law enforcement mechanisms. So this is reflecting contentious interactions between the Philippines and the People's Republic of China in contested areas in the South China Sea. For example, the PRC maintains a constant presence at the contested Scarborough Shoal and occupies 7 outposts on the Spratly Islands. However, this risk indicator also reflects opportunism by other regional actors like Taiwan and Vietnam, whose vessels take advantage of the instability around contested areas to encroach and fish within other areas of the EEZ that have less dedicated personnel for fisheries enforcement. And then moving to the final governance indicator of counter IUU fishing and sustainability initiatives. This indicator assesses the level of government effort and action to address IUU fishing and or improve sustainable fisheries management. For the Philippines, this comes in at 5.45 or medium risk, and it's reflective of enforcement shortcomings that I've previously touched on, challenges created by contested maritime boundaries and unclear enforcement and policy implementation responsibilities, but is tempered by the Marcos administration declaring sustainable fisheries a priority, improving capacity building in nearshore waters, and partnering with allies in the Indo-Pacific on certain maritime security exercises. So these are just some of our high-level findings. More details are provided in our risk analysis reports, and our policy recommendations reports provide some insights into how you can further temper the risk associated with some of these categorical scores and indicators. For me, I think a real value of this dashboard is the ability to compare regionally and between seascapes. There's a real opportunity to kind of take best practices maybe used in one country and to understand how that could be applied to another country and through the avenue of regional intergovernmental organizations. This dashboard is free to explore online at the Stimson Center website, and we will paste that link in the chat. And I really encourage you to take a dive into some of these other categorical risk indicators and look at all the other countries as well. So with that, I will turn it back to Brian, who I believe will close out the presentation portion of the of our webinar. One second, I just need to pull back up the.
Well, we don't need the slide. If we don't need it, we can move right to the moderated Q&A. And thank you, Madeline, for that deep dive. If you found that interesting and rich, just that 10-minute brief overview for the Philippines and South China Sea, remember there's another one of those for the Sulawesi seascape for the Philippines, which is a different perspective and a different set of stakeholders who were interviewed for that risk survey. And then multiply that across all the other countries that were scoped through this research, and you develop a very robust picture of the drivers of risk for IUU fishing in Southeast Asia, in the seas of Southeast Asia, and we look forward to continuing this research, finding new ways to move this particular research forward in the region, and then apply it in other parts of the world. And I think Carolyn has some thoughts to share about that before we move to our moderated Q&A. Carolyn, to you.
So before we move on to questions, and I see some in my other screen here, so we've already got a good conversation going. But I wanted to take a minute to sort of close us out here and highlight some of the important outcomes that we've learned through this research. One of the things that I think is the most interesting and the most relevant to this group is really the adaptability of this research and this methodology, and being able to apply it both in the South China Sea and also the Sulawesi seascape really offers a good comparison. It serves to the proof of concept for this methodology to focus on building data sets where there are currently data gaps. One of our lessons learned here is that it's important to do a stakeholder-led process and to really capture the perspectives and voices of folks who are on the ground experiencing this issue, as well as the folks who are taking on the governance process for these challenges. And so being able to uplift the regional voices and integrate these perspectives into national level governance efforts, national level work to improve marine protected areas, to expand, to broaden fishing permits, to be more directed about licensing vessels. I think it offers a really interesting opportunity to integrate those important community voices in the policymaking process. One of the things that we're hoping to do is to continue this methodology and both in the region itself and also apply it in other data scarce environments, whether they're terrestrial or marine. I think there's the proof of concept here is clear, and I think the extractive industries, water scarcity, food scarcity, energy scarcity, there's a lot of opportunities here to dive deeper into how how these challenges play out in real time. So I'm just going to turn it over to our questions online.
Carolyn, actually, before we do
Yes, sir.
that, I failed to mention a really important member of this research team, and I was saving it to this point so that we could honor this person. And that is the director of your program, Sally Uzel, who helped bring this research forward, find the project, provided comments on and readings of all of the products, and was there through the entire project. Sally, if you're listening, thanks so much. Sally's going to be leaving her post as director of this program at the beginning of next month, but sticking with us, and we're very happy that she's sticking with us as an emeritus fellow to support the program. So Sally, hats off to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian. Perfect. Okay, so we've got a couple questions online. One is from a colleague in Indonesia who is who is characterizing it as a complicated, especially the South China Sea, a complicated challenge. What were some of the obstacles that you faced in doing this research? It seems like it might be delicate. Brian or Madeline, you want to take that one?
I think at first, one is a group of American researchers coming to Southeast Asia to do research on this particular issue. We had to demonstrate that we were there to not just say, look deeply at the encroachment issue or the overlapping claims, but be more concerned about issues that are underexplored and to work with communities and talk and travel to the field within various countries and sit down with fishers to learn about their particular challenges. Also, demonstrating how the methodology can produce results is a challenge. We've got a survey tool with a few score of survey respondents that can be used to inform policymaking and investments in this. And there are those that are critical of kind of the low sample size. But at the same time, this structured expert judgment method tests the person who takes the survey on their knowledge of IUU fishing and related risks. And those who have higher levels of knowledge get higher scores or higher weighted scores. Those that demonstrate they really don't know and maybe they shouldn't be taking the survey, their scores are either removed from the survey or weighted very low. And this is one way that we can kind of hone in on the expertise and develop reliable results. Madam, other challenges to producing this research?
I think that there is the challenge of data access and the comfortability of regional governments in sharing data and kind of working collaboratively, especially in the South China Sea on this issue. So sharing specifics about the current maybe work they're doing to assess ecological health can be a little contentious. And like Brian said, being American researchers, going to the region and researching this topic, there's a need for capacity building and trust building. And in addition, and that can be a real challenge in kind of parsing out some of the how to ask the right questions and to kind of make everyone in the room a little bit more comfortable to open up and discuss this issue. I think especially with small scale fishers, it's their livelihood, and it's a huge food security issue. And as a result, discussing it and discussing counter IUU fishing mechanisms can be very politically contentious. But as many feel that these counter IUU fishing mechanisms can specifically hurt their livelihoods more than commercial vessels who receive things like fishery subsidies. And so kind of communicating that by doing more robust research, you can better target these policies is kind of a way to overcome that challenge.
Fantastic. Thanks for answering that both. We've got a few questions on the data dashboard in particular. And so one is, A question about whether these maps and seascapes will be updated regularly. This person says, I can see the value in the private sector who's sourced from these areas incorporating this into their work and activities. How will these maps be updated?
Well, there's kind of two ways to go about this. One, if our team has more resources to update these on a regular basis, essentially by reissuing the survey on a yearly basis to the same respondents or to different respondents, that's one way that the data could be updated. Currently, the project is at kind of a ending of its current round of funding, and we're looking to gather more for further research. But another way to do it is to teach stakeholders on the ground and actors on the ground, particularly within these organizations that have regional transboundary remits, to do the surveys themselves and to update it on their own. And we're very much happy and willing to do that and partner with organizations on adopting this tool and this approach, or adapting this approach to approaches that are used in the region to come up with a synthesis or a new way of assessing IUU fishing risk.
And then similarly on the data dashboard, what are how can we utilize the dashboard to push government and the private sector to improve the status quo at the moment? How can we use this dashboard?
I'm happy to jump in here. I think that within any government, there's a large suite of agencies that have to be active to really build robust policy. And not all staff members or policymakers are familiar with the ecological impacts of IUU fishing or the economic drivers of the fisheries industry. And I think that this dashboard could be a good way to kind of illustrate to, a layman policymaker that this is like a very real problem, and we have fish stocks teetering on the verge of collapse with production like showing no signs of slowing down. And it can illustrate a food security risk. It illustrates a human security risk through forced labor and human trafficking on large commercial vessels, and at the same time provides some detailed policy recommendations that are digestible and pretty easy to understand, and kind of the thought process behind what would make those policy recommendations work. But Brian, do you have any thoughts?
I thought your answer was very sufficient. Thank you, Madeline.
So did I, Madeline. So there's a couple of questions. So the application of the CORVI methodology is truly a tool. It offers data where data doesn't currently exist. And so one of our colleagues here from the Philippines says that we have an IU fishing index and threat assessment tool called iFit. Are you familiar with this tool, and how is it connected to this work?
Great. That's a great question. So there are a number of IUU fishing risk indexes and projects out there that produce similar results. Ours is the first to do it at a regional level or regional scope, or two regions actually, two seascapes. So the benefit of this approach, one, regional gives you a comparative view to compare kind of apples to apples across countries in similar sectors, and then also inform the regional organizations that are working on these various issues to find and develop the connective tissue through science diplomacy, through data sharing, through dialogues that can reduce the risk to IUU fishing and improve environmental and marine outcomes. The Philippines example, the iFit tool, is a great example of a really deep dive into LGUs, the local governance units in the Philippines. So that's looking at the smallest units of governance throughout the entire country of the Philippines. One country view, deep dive to the local unit level, a different scope from ours. And these can really be enjoined to inform each other. For example, a similar approach to the IFIT could be put to use in Indonesia, but the indicators and research that are developed through our methods could point the way as to what to look at with a deeper dive in a different country. So there are ways that these tools complement each other. They certainly don't work to overlap or to be redundant. But the other, I think, finally, the benefit of the CORVI method is it's relatively inexpensive to do at this transboundary and regional level. I won't get into the details, but to produce this research did not cost millions of dollars. It's an effort of engaging with local people, having constant conversation with them to produce the results, and at the same time, the structured expert judgment method allows you to produce the research through a relatively small group of experts across a variety of sectors.
Super helpful. I think just to echo Brian, the complementarity of this tool with many others is going to make research, policymaking, governance structures much more robust and more informed. And so I think it's great to make sure we're connecting on all of these things. One other question here about the data dashboard here. How can these regional states fulfill their law enforcement capabilities? Is it capacity of officers or assets? So it sounds like, is the question, is it lacking technical experience or operational experience in terms of better fulfilling the law enforcement component here?
Madeline, do you want to take that? And at the same time, you might want to talk about resource allocation to other sectors like subsidies for fishing industries.
Yes, yeah. So this is a good question. It varies between, there are different needs in the offshore environment versus the nearshore environment. In the nearshore, the fishers that are cleared to fish are small scale or artisanal within the first 12 nautical miles from a coastline. And this is important because there's currently a lot of commercial vessel intrusions into nearshore waters. A lot of what is needed in nearshore waters involves capacity building surrounding things like, registering vessels and seeing what is the best way and least, maybe the way with the least administrative burden for small-scale fishers to appropriately report their catch and to register their vessel. There are also newer issues due to things like climate change, increasing the amount that small-scale fishers are spending on to kind of recover their boats if they go out if their boat is damaged during a storm. And so, like I mentioned in the Philippines case study, we have the federal government, the Bureau for Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, really doing a great thing and kind of trying to build capacity and streamline policy between the federal government and municipal level coastal communities and the local governance units to kind of see how they can make this, easier for everybody and make sure that catch is being reported. But this also relates to the offshore environment because, like Carolyn and I mentioned before, you have the race to fish mentality where a lot of effort is spent trying to kind of monitor and regulate around these contested areas. And as a result, there just isn't enough personnel to monitor these massive EEZs, and the personnel that they have and the assets that they have are largely going to monitor things like maritime militias or to monitor research vessels or to monitor activities at contested areas. And this is driven not only by, national sovereignty needs, but the demand for industrial capacity food production of fish.
Mhm.
And this goes back to fishery subsidies, which Southeast Asia is very well known to have nations invest a lot in the capacity of their commercial fleet. And as a result, it leads to overcapacity in the number of vessels in the offshore environment. And so these vessels are given subsidies so they can kind of sit and wait for an opportunity to fish and flood a spot that is deemed to have more stocks. And this can make it very difficult to monitor and enforce against them. So really to answer your question, the World Trade Organization Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies is currently being pushed to be ratified. That would be a great first step to acknowledge that, but to also kind of take a step back and understand that the big In the big picture, the current thing that is being impacted the most is ecological health and the economic well-being of small-scale fishers, and kind of changing the dialogue that is put forward between these countries when talking about the South China Sea in particular. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. That is excellent. We've got a lot more questions, and so I want to make sure we get to them. So one question from online is, does your research also present examples of successful approaches to reducing IUU fishing risk in a particular country? So for example, the Philippines set up an online tool that allowed people to safely and anonymously report an illegal fishing event or incident to local authorities. Sharing successful approaches can be quite helpful for other countries to act.
This is a great question. And as you read through the research, you'll see that some countries' risk scores are lower for certain indicators and categories than others. So this is likely indicating better practices towards regulating and combating IUU fishing. If my memory serves me well, Malaysia scored relatively low across numerous risk scores and their indicators. Madeline, do you want to run us through some of your reflections on what's working in Malaysia, and then maybe other lower risk scores in other countries, and what drove those lower risk scores?
Yeah, for sure. I will give one example from Malaysia. So Malaysia scored significantly lower on indicators related to employment in the maritime fisheries sector. And the reason why is because a lot of those employed on commercial vessels aren't actually domestic. They're not from Malaysia. They're from other countries in the region working on these commercial vessels. So the perceived risk of the impact of IUU fishing to the livelihood of Malaysian fishers is perceived as significantly lower because those working on the commercial vessels, simply put, are, for the most part, not Malaysian fishers. Another example would be Indonesia, which scored lower on scores related to nearshore and offshore fish stock health. There is the perception from key informants in the region that is also backed up now by some data that was, I believe, released last year, that Indonesia has relatively healthier fish stocks than other countries in the region, both in the Sulawesi seascape in the South China Sea. But this has sort of served to be a double-edged sword for the country, as this is now becoming more common knowledge. There's been reports that there is opportunism by countries in the region, or not countries, but vessels, foreign flag vessels, and to kind of encroach on the Indonesia's fish stocks and take advantage of the fact that they're relatively more healthy. So those are just two examples of some of the variation in scores.
Speaking of variation in scores, this is from one of our colleagues from Conservation International, does your assessment of IUU fishing risk differentiate between illegal activities from national fleets, small-scale fishers, and distant water fleets? And are the associated policy and governance recommendations sensitive to those differences between those three types of fishing fleets?
Yeah, I can jump in here. So the survey that is distributed well, I'll start with the interview process. The interview questions do cover kind of discussing maybe the differences in the offshore fleet, the domestic fleet, foreign fishing vessels, and artisanal vessels as well. And from there, the survey methodology therefore also incorporates those types of questions. And then we base all of our desk research off of the surveys and off of the interviews as well. So yes, it does account for it, and the reports go more in depth onto, how different types of vessels contribute to IUU fishing risk. And in addition, the policy recommendations report, it does the same thing. This was developed through a policy dialogue process and is divided into 4 different categories. One of them is capacity building and technical support, which focuses really more on like how to build capacity for small scale and artisanal vessel monitoring and how to handle that side. And then the conservation portion touches both on the destruction caused by foreign flag vessels and larger industrial vessels, but also how some destructive fishing practices by medium-sized vessels can really do a lot of damage as well. So there's a lot of variation in the things covered both in the policy recommendations reports and the risk profiles.
I think that differentiation between those three types of fleets really gets at the complexity of the IUU fishing problem because um, the impacts of IUU fishing are very different based on who is perpetrating that activity. And so I think there's a lot more work to do on that component and to really dive deeply into what that looks like. So appreciate that question. Thank you so much. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, noting that we have about 6 minutes left. But before we leave, please do reach out to our team if you have any questions, if you want a specific briefing on a specific country. One of the questions here is, are you planning to brief any of the specific countries that you have analyzed? And I can answer that one. Yes, indeed. We are hoping to connect with our regional partners on the ground, with our national level governance folks, to really get a sense of, to really dive deeply. As Madeline shared a case study, she just shared the Philippines in the South China Sea. There's a whole separate set of research on Sulu Sulawesi. There's other countries. And then there's, of course, this regional application where we can compare across all. So many, these questions are so excellent. I hope you.
Carolyn, if I could
Yes,
add
sir.
as well, one of the pressing issues is the EU's issuance of red and yellow cards to Cambodia and Vietnam, respectively, over the years that either prevents the export of fish from, say, Cambodia to the EU, or gives concern, say, for Vietnam in its exports to the EU. This is something that came up. The card system came up numerous times during our research, and we think that particularly the analysis on Vietnam can be put to use by the Vietnamese government and those who are investing in improving outcomes there to help relieve Vietnam of this status, the kind of this black mark on its fishing industry that prevents or threatens to prevent certain kinds of exports. So I encourage you to read the Vietnam sections. We also look at the blue boat issue, which is kind of an illicit grouping of Vietnamese fishers that roam the world, much like China's distant water fleets do, and and just plunder fishing grounds outside of the auspices of the ability of Vietnam's government to enforce or monitor these activities. So there's a section in there about the blue boats, what the drivers are that keep them out there, as well as the damage that they do, also in relation to this card system.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And that's a good connection there with some of the other broader level policy that have an impact on local level work. So really, really important. One question here is, did your analysis consider the extent to which IU fishing reinforces or exploits systemic corruption across local, national, and regional governance structures? This is a very good question. I'm happy to cover it from the climate resilience side. So in terms of our governance indicators that we used for this study here in the South China Sea and in the Sulu Sulawesi seascape, we did not assess corruption. However, it is one of the indicators in our broader work for governance resilience in the climate space. And so this is such an interesting component of this challenge, and I think our team would be absolutely curious to see and assess this deeply at the country level. I don't know if Brian or Madeline want to add anything else.
Well, it wasn't like Carolyn mentioned, it's a part of the broader CORVI process. And while it wasn't directly asked about in this process, it is something that came up and is touched on in the reports, and definitely something that we would like to discuss further. Things like some of the small scale fishing communities describing the system as pay to play, where industrial vessels can encroach and pay off fisheries enforcement agents, and they have to kind of just compete with that when they can't afford, to bribe a fisheries enforcement agent. And corruption would be discussed from NGOs, for example, in the government. So because we're casting sort of a wide net of stakeholders, we get a good feel for the different limitations in the policy implementation process, including corruption.
Perfect. Okay, and I've got a couple of other questions here about whether offshore mineral and gas extraction were considered in the creation of the dashboard, and also similarly, relatedly, were there any remote sensing monitoring processes for offshore fisheries included in the analysis?
With the remote sensing answer, I'll answer that quickly. We saw numerous ways which remote sensing can be put to use for both research and reducing IUU fishing. We profile some of these processes, particularly Malaysia's best practices in tracking vehicles using remote sensing techniques. We did not use remote sensing techniques ourselves, but at the same time, we learned about many ways and new opportunities and windows of opportunities that environmental and marine environmental issues in these seas can be monitored using remote sensing. And we're in conversations with those who are interested in this topic and hope to take some efforts forward in this area in the future.
Fantastic. And for the mineral and gas extraction considerations in the dashboard.
So it's not a variable that's considered in the dashboard, but I will point you to an excellent data dashboard by the Asian Maritime Transparency Initiative that maps all of the current offshore natural gas licenses and in extraction areas. But once again, in the economic indicator and also the government governance category, natural gas exploration and resource extraction outside of just fisheries is something that came up as contributing to broader maritime boundary tensions and would be something that, if we're applying this to a seascape, would be, I think, worthy of including in future analysis using this methodology.
Fantastic. I will quickly put our contact information because we have run out of time. I'm certain that our team could absolutely talk for many more hours on this, and we'd love to take any more questions that you have. So I'll put my email in the chat if you'd like to connect with us again. Please explore the data dashboard. Please take a look at the all of the research products. And I want to make a plug for our team is going to be publishing a policy memo in early June to talk more about this. I think it's going to be a really this has been such a great conversation, great start to working on this issue in this area. So please reach out. Brian put my email in the chat, cgruber@stimson.org. We're looking forward to continuing this work with you all.